In this interactive video, we'll continue with our discussion of some of the basic concepts and teachings of Islam. So first, we need to discuss the five pillars, what's known as the five pillars of Islam. And remember also that according to Islam, before Muhammad, there actually were three great messengers. So first, God revealed the truth of monotheism through Abraham, according to Islam. Um, then God revealed the Ten Commandments through Moses. And then God revealed the Golden Rule, do unto others, through Jesus. Right? But the question remained, exactly how should we behave? Right? This is, doctrinal. There's only one God, not many. Here's what you can't do, right? Thou shalt not. Um, Here is, do unto others, which is general, right? It leaves a question. Exactly how should we act in the world and every day? So Muslims believe that God or Allah revealed this through Muhammad and the Quran. So the five pillars are the principles that regulate the private life of Muslims in their dealings with Allah, in their dealings with God. And those five are faith, prayer, fasting, almsgiving or charity, and pilgrimage, which is the journey to Mecca. And we'll take each of these in turn. So first, again, if I'm messing up the pronunciation of any of these, please um, let me know. Happy to be corrected. Um, Shahada, which is faith. That's the first pillar, um, right, in Islamic creed, right? The confession of faith, which goes essentially like this: There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. It's that simple, essentially, right? And at least once during his or her lifetime, a Muslim must say the Shahada correctly, slowly, thoughtfully, aloud, and with full understanding and conviction, right? Not just wake up in the morning and go, there is no God but Allah, Muhammad is brother, right? It has to, one of the aims or goals in a Muslim's life is to be able to say this authentically, to really mean it and really feel it at least once during his or her lifetime, hopefully more. Then the second of the five pillars of Islam is prayer or salah, in which the Quran adjures the faithful to be constant or reminds them or commands them to be constant. So they're warned to be constant in prayer so that they keep your lives in perspective. Pray regularly because we often forget that we didn't create ourselves and we didn't create this world. There's lots of stuff we do in this world. There's lots of stuff we make, lots of stuff we accomplish, but ultimately we are not responsible for our, brute metaphysical existence, and we didn't make the world. Something else did, namely Allah. So we have to, as human beings, we have to constantly remind ourselves of this because we tend to forget. So that's the function of the second pillar of Islam, prayer. Um, and there are five stipulated prayer times. So the first is on arising, when you wake up, and then when the sun reaches its zenith in the sky or high point, um, then at its mid decline, then at sunset, and then before retiring or before going to bed. And then as for the prayer's content, it has to have a standard theme. And those themes are praise and gratitude and supplication. Then the third of the five pillars of Islam is fasting or psalm. And it's practiced during the observance of Ramadan, which is the month of fasting, and that happens in the ninth month of the Islamic calendar. So it falls in different times on, the everyday modern English Christian calendar. And that's the time when Muslims fast from dawn until sunset, no eating. Um, and then Ramadan, the whole month, ends with the Eid al-Fitr. I know that I butchered that, but help me if you can, which is the festival of breaking the fast. Then the fourth pillar of the five is charity or zakah. And that's essentially this, that those who have much should help lift the burden of those who are less fortunate. Be charitable. Mm. And the actual figure that the Quran set for this tax on Muslims was 1/40th, right? But not just their income, all your holdings, right? So you should give 1/40 of, well, excuse me, 2.5% essentially to charity. But this isn't like a tithe for the maintenance of religious institutions like Catholics would do. It's meant to go directly to the needy, not go to the church and its fortitude, but to, or the mosque, right, and its fortitude, but to directly to the needy. Then the fifth pillar is Hajj, or the pilgrimage. So, once during his or her lifetime, every Muslim who is physically and economically in a position to do so is expected to journey to Mecca from wherever they are, right? Because Mecca is where Allah's climactic revelation was first disclosed to Muhammad. So you're supposed to take a pilgrimage to Mecca. So these pilgrims, you remove your normal everyday clothes, so you don't go in your normal stuff. You wear simple white clothes called ihram, and that's in order to remove class distinctions. So you can't show up at the pilgrimage and tell the difference between a wealthy Muslim and an impoverished Muslim, for instance. Everybody's wearing the same stuff, and you're supposed to look the same because you're essentially on the same mission for the same purpose. Now, the five pillars of Islam consist of things that Muslims do to keep the house of Islam standing firm, right? Islam essentially says practice the five pillars so that our religious institution can stay strong and whole and organized and well intended and well spirited. Um, there are also things though that you should not do. Like, five pillars of Islam's are things that you should do, but then there's also stuff that Muslims should not do, like gambling, thieving, lying, eating pork, drinking intoxicants, and being sexually promiscuous are just some of these prohibitions under Islam. Also, Islam teaches that sin is an act, it's not a state of being. And that's an important distinction to draw here. That um, that you are not constantly in a state of fallenness and sinfulness that you have to redeem yourself from. You we are of divine origin, Islam teaches, and we are, therefore good. And sin is a forgetting of our goodness. It's an act. There's a sinful act, not a sinful person. And then there's also, to accompany these ideas, um, Islam says there's a place of punishment for evildoers, kind of like, the concept of hell. It's called Jahannam. And Sunnism actually divides it into 7 different circles. And that's an interesting concept that you can look up if you'd like. Now, some of the social teachings of Islam. So, as we mentioned in the last interactive video, before Muhammad, there was virtually no restraint on internal violence in that region. Glaring inequities in wealth and possessions were accepted as just the natural order of things. That's just the way things go. Some people have a lot more, some people have a lot less. Essentially, might makes right. And that's the way of the world. That's the way things are, and the way, hence, they ought to be. So, also, before Muhammad, women were regarded more as possessions than as human beings. Before Muhammad, drunkenness and large-scale gambling was widespread in let's say Arabia, right? But thanks to Islamic law and Muhammad, it's argued, within a half a century, there was this remarkable change in the moral climate on all of these counts. Um, and further, Islamic law is of grand and enormous scope, but its provisions, what it stipulates, can be summarized into basically like 4 areas of collective life. That's economics, status of women, race relations, and the use of force. And we'll take each of these in turn. So, regarding economics and the social teachings of Islam, the idea is that, look, until bodily needs are met, higher concerns cannot flower. If you can't eat and drink and shelter yourself, it's very difficult to concentrate on anything other than those basic bodily needs. We all understand that. Anybody who's working through school and working for a living understands that. Certain things get marginalized, and one of the first things to go are these higher spiritual concerns. So the health of society requires that material goods be widely and appropriately distributed. Make sure that as many people as possible have their material needs, their basic needs covered so that they can practice certain, they can focus on other things than just eating, drinking, and keeping themselves safe. Um, so these are the basic principles of Islamic economics, right? Simply insist that acquisitiveness and competition be balanced by fair play and by compassion for the poor and charity, right? One of the pillars. So the Quran outlawed the practice of primogeniture, which restricted inheritance of wealth to the oldest son and had the effect of concentrating wealth into the hands of a few enormous estates. So prior to Muhammad, this was the way that wealth was inherited. Um, whatever wealth, let's say a father had accumulated, it went to the oldest son and not to all the children, just to the oldest son. So it concentrated wealth into just a few gigantic estates and essentially estranged the wealth from everybody else. So the Quran sees to it that all heirs share in inheritance, right? Share the wealth, spread it out. That's the effect is. Excuse me. Now, the status of women. Um, So Quranic reforms improved women's status incalculably, immeasurably. So first, the Quran forbade infanticide, killing of infants, because it was mostly females that were killed in this practice. right? Families wanted men because they thought men would grow up to be, you know, um, stronger and be able to provide for the health of the family, right, and the welfare of the family within those certain systems at the time. So they would kill females mostly. Um, Also, the Quranic reforms required that daughters be included in inheritance, not equally, but they had to be included. Um, Quranic reforms at least leave open the possibility of equality with men. Well, I think that's little understood, but that's the case. It's possible for women to be equal with men under the Quran. Further, the Quran sanctified marriage by making it the sole lawful locus or place of the sexual act. Marriage required female consent, right? So you had if you wanted to marry a woman, she had to consent. And now, under the Quran, sex should occur or happen only within um, marriage, right? So this was an improvement for women's status at the time. And then with regard to the veiling, um, the Quran itself even shows some restraint here. It says, "Tell your wives, the veiling and to veil your face and your hair." Right? Um, the Quran says, "Tell your wives and daughters and the women of the believers to draw their cloaks closely round them, right, when they go abroad. That will be better." So, or outside the household, really. So that will be better so that they may be recognized and not annoyed, not pestered by men. So that's a bit of restraint that's shown about this concept and practice of veiling, in the Quran at least. And then regarding the social teachings um, of Islam, there are teachings about race relations. So Islam stresses racial equality and has achieved a remarkable degree of interracial coexistence compared to other religions. Um, Also, intermarriage is kind of a model, one of the early models um, in Islam, as exhibited by Abraham's, marriage to Hagar that we discussed when we looked at, in the last video, right? It was Sarah's servant. Was somewhat of an intermarriage. They were of different, I guess you wouldn't necessarily call it faiths back then, different origins. Um, Further, and something more recent, on his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1964, Malcolm X discovered that racism had no precedent in Islam, and he couldn't. He discovered that he couldn't keep up the program that he was attempting to enact, and in America, which was racial division, right? Separate yourself from the white man. Once he went to Mecca and saw that there were people of all colors, creeds, sexes, wealth, everything, he realized that he couldn't, that if to be a good Muslim, he could not keep up the kind of teachings he had been uh, practicing, extolling in America. So, just as a for instance, before his pilgrimage in 1964, here's a quote from Malcolm X. "It's just like when you've got some coffee that's too black, which means it's too strong. What do? You integrate it with cream. You make it weak. If you pour too much cream in, you won't even know you ever had coffee. It used to be hot, it becomes cool. It used to be strong, it becomes weak. It used to wake you up, now it'll put you to sleep." And hopefully you see the analogy here, right? Coffee that's too black and strong, meaning, African American people, Once you integrate it with white people, it becomes weak, puts you to sleep, cool, ineffective, etc. So that was his perspective before his pilgrimage to Mecca. But after his pilgrimage to Mecca, he said this: there were tens of thousands of pilgrims from all over the world. They were of all colors, from blue-eyed blondes to black-skinned Africans. But we were all participating in the same ritual, displaying a spirit of unity and brotherhood that my experiences in America had led me to believe never could exist between the white and the non-white. You may be shocked by these words coming from me. But on this pilgrimage, what I have seen and experienced has forced me to rearrange much of my thought patterns previously held and to toss aside some of my previous conclusions. I just wanted to show you a quick video here.
Malcolm X.
I think a lot of people are confused by the new Arabic name, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz.
I've always had the name on my passport, Malik El-Shabazz, only I only used it in the Muslim world. Well, Hajj is a title that is given to any Muslim who makes the pilgrimage to Mecca during the official Hajj season.
Well, will you now use Shabazz and drop X?
I'll probably continue to use Malcolm X and I'll probably use it as long as the situation that produced it exists.
You don't feel that Shabazz takes the place of X?
My going to Mecca and going into the Muslim world, into the African world, and being recognized and accepted as a Muslim and as a brother may solve the problem for me personally. But I personally feel that my personal problem is never solved as long as the problem is not solved for all of our people in this country. So I remain Malcolm X as long as there is a need to protest and struggle and fight against the injustices that our people are involved in this country.
Are you prepared to go into the United Nations at this point and ask that charges be brought against the United States for its treatment of American Negroes?
Oh, yes. Please.
I think you're right in my chair.
The audience will have to be quiet. Yes, as I pointed out when I was during my traveling, that African nations and Asian nations and Latin American nations look very hypocritical when they stand up in the United Nations condemning the racist practices of South Africa and that which is practiced by Portugal and Angola, and saying nothing in the UN about the racist practices that are manifest every day against Negroes in this society. Even in South Africa, those Africans aren't faced with bayonets and aren't faced with police dogs. I would be not a man. If I was in a position to bring it in front of the United Nations and didn't do so, I wouldn't be a man.
Malcolm, do you intend to lead the charge in the United Nations?
Well, I find that to say you're going to lead something creates a lot of hostility, division, jealousy, and envy. I hope to work with any group of leaders or any group of organizations to do whatever is necessary to see that this problem is brought before the United Nations.
Have you had any commitments from any nations in Africa to support you in such a move?
I would rather not say at this time. But one thing I found in my travels, all of them look upon us as their long-lost brother.
You realize the implication is that you have had such commitments when you say...
This is your interpretation of what I said. One thing that I found in all of my travels was that all of the Africans, not only the Africans, but the Asians and the Muslims, look upon us as their long-lost brothers. And America had actually tricked many of them into a hands-off policy by giving them the impression that she was honestly trying to do something to solve the problem. My argument over there was designed to prove that it is impossible for the United States government to solve the race problem. It's impossible.
Malcolm, on your trip abroad, you said you sensed a feeling of great brotherhood and that conceivably you would be working toward integration in this country now. At least this is what you're reported to have said. Have you any comment on it?
I don't think that I ever mentioned anything about working toward integration. They haven't even got integration right here in New York City. You have worse integration problems in the North than they have in the South. So if it doesn't work if you can't bring about integration in New York City as international, cosmopolitan, up-to-date as it's supposed to be, you will never get integration anywhere else in the country.
Are you prepared to work with some of the leaders of the other civil rights organizations?
Certainly, certainly. We will work with any groups, organizations, or leaders in any way, as long as it's genuinely designed to get results.
Does your new beard have any religious significance?
No, not particularly, but I do think that you'll find black people in America, as they strive to throw off the shackles of mental colonialism, will also probably reflect an effort to throw off the shackles of cultural colonialism, and they may begin to reflect desires of their own, with standards of their own.
Malcolm, your more controversial remarks was a call for black people to get rifles and form rifle clubs sometime back. Do you still favor that for self-defense?
I don't see why that should be controversial. I think that if white people found themselves the victim of the same kind of brutality that black people in this country face, and they saw that the government was either unwilling or unable to protect them, that the intelligence on the part of the whites would make them get some rifles and shotguns and protect themselves. Now, Negroes are developing some kind of intellectual maturity too. And they can see that having waited upon the government to protect them has been a wait that has been in vain. So any of them who live in areas where the government is not able to do its job, then we do have to get together and do a job of protecting ourselves.
No Negro leaders have fought for...
So that was Malcolm X speaking about the change of heart he experienced after his pilgrimage to Mecca. So to pick up, we're talking about Islam and social relations, right? So another aspect of their teachings on social relations is on the use of force. So the Quran allows punishment of wrongdoers to the full extent of the injury they impart. That's essentially an eye for an eye, right? The Quran doesn't counsel turning the other cheek or pacifism. Essentially says you harm me, I can harm you in an equal way as retribution. So Muhammad incorporated the principle of religious toleration into his charter for Medina, that place that's north of Mecca. So Islam's record on the use of force is really no darker than that of Christianity, although it's thought to be in a lot of the popular imagination. Right? It really isn't any darker than that of Christianity. Muslims deny that the blots in their record should be held against their religion. Right? Don't hold every religion has its own dark periods and dark times and dark acts and behaviors, right? But don't hold it against the religion, they say, right? As a matter of fact, the presiding ideal of Islam is imparted in their standard greeting to one another, which is Assalamu alaikum. Peace be unto you. So instead of greeting, each other is, hey, what's up? The standard greeting is peace be unto you. And jihad literally means exertion. So the definition of holy war in Islam is virtually identical with that of the just war or in Christianity. So that concept in Christianity is known as jus ad bellum, or the just or justified war, right? No different than what the holy war is in Muslim. But greater jihad occurs within one's own heart and own mind and own soul, right? And then warring with external forces is known as lesser jihad. It's an interesting distinction. And then finally, on the distinction between Sunni and Shiite Muslims, and I thought I'd capture this with a short video as well.
When we watch the news and see reporters talking about the conflicts that are playing out across the Middle East, we hear a lot about fighting between the Sunnis and the Shiites, the two main sects of Islam. But many of us have no idea what the difference between the two groups is and why there is so much friction between them. So let's take a look at some of the history and the geopolitics to get a sense of what is really going on.
متكئين فيها على الأرائك لا يرون فيها.
There are 1.6 billion Muslims across the world. Roughly 85% of them are Sunnis. The division began after the death of the Prophet Muhammad some 1,400 years ago as a disagreement about who should succeed him. The Sunnis felt that Abu Bakr, a close friend of the Prophet's, ought to be the next Muslim leader. But the Shiites claimed that Muhammad had anointed his son-in-law Ali as rightful successor. The Sunnis won out, but a split was born, and that rift was cemented when Ali's son was later killed by the ruling Sunni troops, an event which the Shiites commemorate every year. Fast forward more than 1,000 years, and the situation is worse than ever. According to a poll by Pew Research, some 40% of Sunnis don't even regard Shiites as real Muslims. But there's more than theology at work here. Perhaps even more important is geography. 100 years ago, around the time of the First World War, the Middle East was carved up in a Franco-British pact called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. But the Europeans had little interest in understanding the religious and ethnic intricacies of the Middle East when they divided up the region. Still, these arbitrary borders became the blueprint for today's map. The Shiites were divided primarily among Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon, with an offshoot of Shia Islam, the Alawites, in Syria. This area has come to be known as the Shia Crescent. Sunni Muslims make up the bulk of the population of other countries in the region, with pockets of Shiites scattered among them. As you might expect, problems arise in countries where both sects are vying for power or one group feels oppressed. In Syria, for example, a Sunni majority has been ruled for the last 45 years by an Alawite minority. In Iraq, a Sunni minority ruled over the Shiite majority for decades. After the U.S. invasion, Saddam Hussein, a Sunni, was overthrown and a Shiite government took over. That government proceeded to marginalize the Sunnis, and now some of those disenfranchised Sunnis have gone on to form the so-called Islamic State, or ISIS. Now let's do a quick who's who in the Middle East. As you've just heard, ISIS, along with al-Qaeda, are Sunni groups. Hezbollah is Shiite. Osama bin Laden was a Sunni. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad is an Alawite, remember that's a Shiite sect, and the Iranian mullahs are Shiites as well, which helps explain why Iran has gotten involved in the conflict in Syria. And where does America stand in all this? Traditionally, the U.S.'s strongest allies in the region have been Sunni powers, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan. But now the U.S. is pursuing a nuclear deal with Shiite Iran and is working alongside Shiites in Iraq to try to destroy ISIS. But at the same time, Washington still supports Saudi Arabia, which is currently bombing Iranian-backed Shiite rebels in Yemen. Confused yet? One satirist summarized the tangled web of conflicting relationships with this map. So what can we conclude? At the end of the day, it's important to remember that the majority of ordinary Sunnis and Shiites do not hate each other, and both groups share the same core tenets of Islam. In a sense, it's similar to the differences between, say, the Catholics and the Protestants, and the fighting and the bloodshed that we're seeing across the region are less about religion than they are about power.
So hopefully that that video shed a little light or reminded you of the difference between Sunni and Shiite and the source of their original conflict and continuing conflict. Okay, so in this video, we covered the 5 pillars of Islam, which includes prayer, fasting, um, charity, faith, and pilgrimage, the social teachings involved in Islam, and also the distinction between, so the distinction and explanation of the Sunni and Shiite conflict.